Welcome to the 5th meeting of the committee in 2014. Can I ask everyone to ensure they've switched off all mobile phones and other electronic equipment, please? We have apologies today from Richard Baker, who is unable to attend today's meeting. I'd like to welcome Sarah Boyack in place of Richard Baker. And can I welcome Dave Stewart to the meeting today as well? He's attending in his capacity as the member in charge of the Defective and Dangerous Buildings Bill. For the benefit of the witnesses today, the approach to questions will take is the committee will ask their questions first, and then the last bit, Mr. Stewart will come in with his questions. So, can I welcome the panel this morning? Unfortunately, we have one panellist who is still trying to get here. Gillian McCarney, Planning and Building Standards Manager of East Renfrewshire Council, will be joining us. Can I welcome John Delamar, Building Standards Manager, Midlothian Council. Alistair MacDonald, Assistant Business Manager, Building Standards Operations, North Lanarkshire Council. Susan Torrance, Policy Manager, Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. And David Sutton, Publicity Officer and Committee Member, Institute of Historic Building Conservation. Do you wish to make any opening statements at all?
The words, because obviously the other witnesses are from local authority backgrounds as such, and as the representative for the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, we come at it from a slightly different perspective, in that of our 277,000 homes that housing associations own in Scotland, roughly 90% of them are up to the Scottish Housing Quality Standard and in good repair. However, there is an issue relating to older tenements which are owned jointly, while associations have the power to intervene and make common repairs to ensure that their tenants are safeguarded and the fabric of the building is safeguarded. The recovery mechanisms in terms of cost are the civil remedies against individuals, which can be long-winded and inevitably, in many cases, result in them being written off and an expense that the association has to bear. So a parallel power, if you like, to the charging order, or cooperation or collaboration with local authorities in terms of being able to use their charging order powers to recover costs would be extremely useful. So I just thought I would make that statement because we are different, obviously, from local authorities.
Before we move on from that, is that a real difficulty for particularly smaller housing associations?
Absolutely. A lot of community-based associations, mainly in Glasgow and Edinburgh, it is a drain on resources, both in terms of staff time pursuing owner-occupiers for any liability and having to obviously expend capital in the first instance, and then having to write it off. I think if it could remain as a liability through the charging order, that would be extremely useful, but in being written off, it's obviously not useful.
Thank you very much indeed for that. If I could maybe turn to Mr. Sutton, first of all, a pretty lengthy written submission from your organisation, sir, which talks quite a lot about existing legislation, some of which seems to be untested. Would you like to make some comment on that, please?
So just to start with 3 quick points. I mean, we support the importance of trying to tackle the area of vacant and derelict buildings. Absolutely. What I think our concern is whether this bill, which is looking rather narrowly at the Building Act notices, when in fact councils, I work in a council and uses a repairs notice or urgent works notice, where it's a listed building or an unlisted building in a conservation area, or indeed if an amenity notice, which can be used under the planning legislation. And what we'd actually like to see is a bit more joined up thinking across those bits of legislation to have a more effective approach. So, for example, when we made representations on the 2011 Historic Environment Amendment Bill, that now has introduced a liability order that is being picked up in other legislation going through at the moment. But I think one of the things, if you say, why do we need this legislation, the one bit of data that we have is in the heritage side is the buildings at risk, which is an annual survey carried out it's every 2 years in Scotland. But in Scotland, there are 8% of buildings at risk. Now, this is of your Category A or top-notch buildings. In England, and that figure has been falling in Scotland from about 8.3%, 8.1% over the last few years. In England, that figure is 4%. And the question that when we have 6 monthly meetings with Historic Scotland is why is there such a difference in Scotland of what is broadly the same categories of building, having twice as many that are at risk and the threatened, their future being threatened. So that's a key point as to why, and the final point I just make at the outset is we need to develop a more robust preventative approach, and that's through, there's a range of measures, whether it's VAT or fiscal incentives or whatever. That isn't, I think, the role of a private member's bill, I would suggest, but I do think it is an issue for the Minister and the Parliament as it goes forward to say, do we value and protect Scotland's heritage? And if we are, why do we not put in place a more robust protection and preservation approach?
I don't want to stray too much off of the bill itself, but you said about the differences between England and Scotland there. Is that possibly because there are more flexibility in terms of the planning situation in England than there is here? Because from my own past local authority experience, it seems that some planners and some of the heritage bodies are unwilling to see certain things going into a building and would rather, it seems in some occasions, it go to rack and ruin rather than allow for a change of use.
I think what we have... The data collection in Scotland is done only every 2 years, and we have been lobbying Historic Scotland that that should be done on an annual basis, jointly working with local authorities, as they do in England, where an electronic survey goes round all the councils to gather that data on an annual basis. So,
and what I'm trying to get to is why it seems to be different in England. Is their planning regime much more flexible in terms of allowing changes of use to buildings?
I think there is recent changes in that direction, but I don't think that most times when a building is derelict, the planning system will be fairly flexible as to uses if they are consistent with that building. So
It's not my experience, it has to be said.
Well, I'm just giving you my experience. I think the issue that we have seen in England, that there has been specific action by particularly the Lottery Fund targeting buildings at risk, and that has, I think, been a contributor. I'm not saying it's the whole of the difference between 4% and 8%, but I do think that repeated targeting of your funding to try and address this, what is identified as a problem. I think in Scotland, as I say, we're struggling to get the data rather than actually moving on to how do we target.
Okay. If we go back to the bill itself, and folks were asked their views about the 30-year repayment period, and your organisation said that you think this is far too long a period and suggested a 10-year maximum for repayment. Would you like to expand on that, Mr Sutton?
Well, I mean, I've been talking to building control colleagues as well, and I think it's effectively you're giving a free loan to the owner of the building. You've got to remember much of the costs of urgent works or repairs to buildings are not, you know, they're more in the 6,000 to 10,000 if they're done effectively at an early stage. I'm not saying there's not some that go above that, but it seems to me it's in danger of being, you know, 30 years, the administrative costs will far outweigh if it was a relatively small sum. But I'm happy for the building standards colleagues who have to deal with that in a more day-to-day. I mean, our experience, or my experience, is that going through the civil procedures, we've got a case at the moment, amenity notice, it's taken 15 months and it's been treated as a negotiable sum, so we won't get back the full costs that we spent on undertaking the works in default. And there's all the costs of going through the courts 15 months later.
Mr MacDonald, would you like to give comment about the 30-year repayment period?
I think the 30-year period would be fine if it was a substantial sum of money. Because you've got to think, if a charging order is split over 30 annual instalments, the average in North Lanarkshire Council for debt is £3,000. Now, obviously, that only equates to like £100 per year. So I think it could be valid, a 30-year period would be valid if it was a substantial sum of money. But one of the problems there is if it's a low sum of money per annum and it's then default, it goes to the default position, and if to chase that money individually, it might be that the council look at that sum of money and think it's not effective chasing it. So where before, if you had something like £3,000, using the usual debt recovery mechanisms, the council would probably pursue something like that. But where if it's £3,000 over that term of years, be a low amount per annum, and then if the person wasn't able or willing to pay and it defaulted, I don't know if we would chase it at that because of the reasoning there, because it's individual payments then. But I think it's valid, yes, for substantial amounts of money.
John Wilson in a supplementary on that.
Thank you, Conveners. Just Mr MacDonald raised the issue about the average debt being £3,000. Is that the average debt for defective repairs?
So we're basically covering our debt recovery within North Lanarkshire for defective and dangerous buildings. The average that the money that we actually try to recover, the average is £3,000. So it's showing it's quite at the low end.
Could I ask other witnesses today whether they can relate to that figure of £3,000, because it does seem very low in relation to the issues that are being raised in terms of the bill.
Mr Delamar?
I would agree that normally the works that we do get involved in, they are a couple of £100 for making a building safe or carrying out the minimum amount of works. Midlothian don't tend to go in and repair a building. We'll do the minimum works involved in Section 29, which is to make the building safe. That recovery generally applies to headless fencing, scaffolding, contractors for cherry pickers, that type of thing. So yeah, I'd agree. The figures that we deal with are probably around about the same, £3,000.
And in terms of 30 years, do you think that that's a fair amount of time? We would suggest that the time should be relative to the person's means to pay and the cost involved, rather than just set a standard 30-year period.
Could I ask Susan Torrance, do you have any figures from
I don't have any figures, but I suspect that the sum that the associations will expend on other people's property is significantly higher, because in terms of looking at the works that they would want to do, they'd probably take a more proactive approach in terms of, rather than minimum repairs, looking at what would bring the building up to standards, so it then has a reasonable life expectancy from the association's point of view. But as I say, I don't have any data on that as such.
In the 30-year period, what's your...
Well, I mean, the key here is the charging order attaches to the title of the property. And while, as you say, people might default on paying the sum of money per annum that they've agreed to pay, the fact is that when the property is sold, you are going to recover the whole sum. So, you know, anything that's flexible and enables us not to write off the debt, which I think is the issue, is what we would support. But, you know, I think I do agree with the points that it should be relative to the debt and also relative to the individual's ability to pay as well, if there was flexibility.
Ms McCartney, welcome to you.
My apologies for being late.
That's not a problem.
My train was cancelled.
Trains have gotten us all at one point, Ms McCartney. Do you have comment on the 30 years, and if you could tell us what the average debt would be?
I would concur with my building standard manager colleagues that £2,000 to £3,000 is normal. However, abnormal costs do come up fairly reasonably. 4 or 5 years ago, we had to do substantial work to a substantial listed building, which was abnormal costs. And in a couple of weeks' time, we are demolishing a property under the dangerous building notice as well, and the costs there are going to be reasonably substantial as well. I do think 30 years is reasonable where we are talking about substantial costs such as that, but East Renfrewshire Council would like to see a shorter period for smaller amounts.
Sutton, you're desperate.
The point I wanted to make is I think the 3,000 has been quoted on an individual one-off, making it safe. If I use the example of Dundivan Church in the outskirts of Coatbridge, over 5 years there's been about 5 interventions which add up to about 15 to 18,000 that we're pursuing what is the cost for. So yes, a one-off incident, but these buildings tend to have a number of incidents over a period of years rather than just be a one-off, and that's a problem solved.
Thank you, Mr Sutton, for reminding us about Dundivan Church, which has been a lot longer than 5 years from my memory, and trying to get something resolved in that building. Can I just get clarification? The £3,000 has been quoted as just to make safe the building rather than carry out the repairs, because what my understanding, the members' bill that's before us, is because of in the 30-year period, is because of some of the substantial costs that have been identified. And I think Susan Torrance made reference to SFHA's members' experience. And I know in Glasgow, at the present moment, individual tenants of properties in the High Street are getting hit with bills of £36,000 to make good what is a defective building, and that's in the older sandstone buildings. And so it's just to get clarification, is that £3,000 to carry out the repairs, or is it just to make safe the building that's involved?
Mr MacDonald.
It's to make safe the building. Basically, what John described, the minimum works, fencing off, boarding up, using a cherry picker, that type of work.
Mr Delmar.
Yes, that's the same. We generally don't get involved in the repair work. We'll do the minimum amount of work under the Act, and that is to make the building safe.
McCartney, is it similar?
Yes, it's exactly the same. The minimum amount of work to make the building safe and exclude the public.
But that may include substantial demolition, as you stated just a few minutes ago.
Some of it does. As I said, that was quite exceptional, but yes, it did involve substantial demolition to make the building safe.
Okay, thank you. Mark MacDonald, is it on this point that you want to come in?
Simply just a short question. I mean, I think we've kind of got to the point anyway, but the witnesses seem to be indicating that perhaps a change in terms of the wording to make it that it's a period of up to 30 years, which provides the flexibility for local authorities to set their own limits in terms of the time period. Is that where the witnesses would see there being some benefit?
Yes, we agree with that.
And just a follow-up on the point that Ms Torrance made, where she rightly identified that obviously the debt attaches to the title of the building, and therefore in event is recoverable when the building is sold. Obviously there are some buildings which this may be relevant to, which are not buildings that would be sold or perhaps eligible for sale, and where do you see the legislation fitting in those regards in terms of debt that's attached to those kind of properties?
I think that would be the exception. The other benefit we were talking about before we came in is where local authorities or housing associations can't identify the owner, and therefore pursuing a civil debt obviously is not possible. But the expectation would be that if there was a charge on the title and it extended for 30 years, there would be a reasonable chance that somebody would want to do something with it within that period of time. So it's about reasonableness, isn't it? I think 50 years, yes, that's you could extend the scope, but I think that's the point I would make.
And is it on this point too? Yes. On you go, Stuart.
Yeah, thank you. Mr Delamar and Ms Torrance, you agreed on the point regarding the means to pay, which was based upon. Now, if that were to be the case, would that not actually incur additional administration costs to deal with each individual case with its own merits?
Mr Delamar, do you want to go first?
Yeah, that would be through discussion with the relevant people who were involved. If we were talking about a block of flats and multiple owners, then again it would be, you can see the scale of cost would come down relevant to each person. If you're then dealing with a substantial building under one ownership relative to the person's means to pay, this would be through negotiation about how much we would expect to have on a yearly basis. And that's what I was trying to get across, is that through discussion with the building owner, we could agree a suitable payment scheme rather than just assuming a 30-year period.
Ms Torrance? Well, I concur. I mean, I think it's about giving flexibility, isn't it? And if an owner genuinely wants to pay but simply can't because of resources, you would enter that negotiation, as you've said. On the other hand, as I say, circumstances where you can't find the owner or clearly the owner is not cooperating, just being able to put a charge on for 30 years would give you some remedy at least to get the cash back within that time.
Okay. Is it in the same subject?
Yes. Just everyone has used the phrase of substantial costs. What is your interpretation of a substantial cost?
Ms Torrance?
Well, Mr Wilson, MSP, quoted was at £36,000 as being a bill that was attributable to an owner. I mean, certainly where roof repairs are concerned, substantial stonework repairs, you could be talking about a bill of £200,000 shared between, say, six proprietors, three of which might be the Housing Association, and they're obviously more than willing to bear their share of that, and then they'll undertake the works, but they're then left in a position of possibly having to write off £100,000.
Mr MacDonald?
Yeah, I would agree. £30,000 and upwards is probably starting to say substantial. Yeah.
Is everybody in agreement round about that figure? Yeah. Mr Sutton, you seem to not be quite in agreement there.
Depends how much you have and what the value. If the land has no value, and that's, I keep coming back to, you have to look at the charging order against the liability order thing, which you can get companies that theoretically, as a paper company with minimum value, and certainly not in Scotland, but I have had experience of people chopping and changing the ownership to try and evade, if you like, repaying. And from the council's point of view, when you have to serve notice and give warning, if the owner keeps changing, we are, if you like, checking weekly at the registers of Scotland as to whether there's been any change. And I think one of the issues with the charging order, there needs to not be a gap created between, if you like, giving notice to an owner that the council may be doing the works in default and getting to where a charging order is registered, which could be, say, a 3-4 month period. And certainly in my experience, those people who may consider 10,000 to be a substantial amount would, if you like, change it to another £100 paper company to evade responsibility.
Thank you. Sarah Boyack, please.
Yes, to follow up both on the 30-year issue and when people pay it back. The bill assumes annual payments, and I think, Mr Sutton, you've suggested that it would be helpful if there was more flexibility. In terms of actually somebody wanting to pay off a debt like this, presumably the capacity to negotiate or to set terms, it would be an agreement with somebody that would be monthly or quarterly rather than an annual sum. Thinking of individual people, an annual sum could be a much more difficult sum to pay rather than something spread over the year. And there's obviously a trade-off about the administration of that. I'm just wondering what the views of everyone was and about alternatives for how people might pay their money back.
Mr Sutton, do you want to go first?
Well, just my experience is that councils would be as flexible as possible to get as much as possible back. The issue, and I think one of the with the bill before you, is that it suggests the sum is flexible. From a council's point of view, we have to put out that money, and providing it is legally defensible, I don't see why the sum is negotiable. But certainly in discussing with my building standards colleagues, it does appear that the approach to the sums is it is a negotiable figure, when in fact the council has had to spend taxpayers' money to undertake these works in the bigger public interest. And therefore it seems to me the sum shouldn't be negotiable, providing we, if you like, make sure we got the cheapest tender and given due notice, etc., etc.
So that wasn't the point I was asking you about. It was the repayment schedules,
yeah,
in terms of flexibility on that.
And I think most council, I mean, the only reason I made that is that if somebody is, say, in receipt of a monthly salary, it may be more helpful to have a monthly charge added than have a lump sum once a year being requested. I think most councils would apply a degree of flexibility, providing they get the money back within a reasonable period.
The building standards folks, is it your experience that there is that level of flexibility in terms of repayment? Ms McCartney, do you want to go first?
I think it would be appropriate for the councils to have that level of flexibility, depending on the circumstances. For example, if it was a block of tenement flat owners, then yes, we would probably want the flexibility if people wanted to pay in monthly or quarterly payments. It may not be appropriate where it is a larger company or a landowner. That may not be the same, but we would certainly want the flexibility to consider those issues with the people.
Mr Delamar?
Yes, as I said earlier, anything that would help the recovery of costs. And even if it was a case of you have a multiple ownership building and somebody wished to pay monthly, somebody may wish to pay annually, as long as we could be seen to be recovering the money, we'd probably accommodate those issues.
Mr MacDonald?
Yes, with the current debt recovery, North Lanarkshire Council already provide us the negotiated expenses and flexible payment period depending on people's individual circumstances, where it takes in one of the things that's mentioned in the bill, that we do offer like a discount if somebody's willing to come to us and to talk to us about it. Obviously we sit and have negotiations, and if they're willing to pay it, as mentioned in the bill, they might possibly get a discount with agreement with the local authority where it's less than 30 years. We already do something like that.
Thank you. Ms Boyack.
Yeah, the other question in there was about the issue of the length of time. Again, in Mr Sutton's paper, you suggest that there could be issues about having longer term payments and that could create legal problems. Are you suggesting that if you have a very long repayment period that people might be able to get out of it through other legal mechanisms? It's paragraph 6A when you talk about legal property issues and other retention documents on a property maybe having only a 5 or a 10-year time period. Are you worried about the issue of 30 years being too long because people will be able to get out of the repayment for other legal matters?
I think it's how do you ensure that that is consistently over the period of time? Because in my experience, I mean, if a site is flattened and has its lowest possible value at that stage, then in due course it's a question of, is there a new positive use that it will at least add value to attract somebody to try and develop it? But sites can remain empty, in my experience, maybe for 10 years. I think 30, I would think, is on the long side to what it should take for reasonable. But it depends, you know, we've seen a downturn in the market and then it's gone up again. So sites in areas like North Lanarkshire, for example, it is difficult to get schemes to stack up, even on blank sites which you're handed or you buy for £1. It can still be difficult for the end value to cover the redevelopment costs on it in a situation like that.
Ms Boyack.
So in terms of this bill, the council, would you be at the front of the queue to get money back if there are other debtors?
But, I mean, my colleagues here from North Lanarkshire, my understanding is there's a 70,000 budget that is more or less, if we don't chase up to get repayments on that, effectively there's not a budget to tackle new work, and that's a constant pressure that the council's budgets are under, that there are responsibilities to the, if you like, the general public good, but those cost money, and unless you can recover the costs, then the council is out of pocket.
Mr MacDonald, North Lanarkshire has been mentioned there. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I agree with something Dave said there. I think the recovery of expenses at the end of the period at a sale or whatever is a good thing, because especially if you can't find the owner or the owner's overseas or something. But within North Lanarkshire, you can have the negative equity factor where the actual site is virtually worthless. So you might not have the same degree of confidence of getting the money back that you've had the initial outlay. So that's a problem. Also, there's one other come in there. I was thinking about it. At the stage of the sale of the property, again, you're wanting to have a degree of confidence that any money you've had an outlay, you're wanting to get it back. There may be political pressure to drop the debt so that the site or property can be developed. Because if you think about it, sometimes you need to think about the overall community, depending on what the building is or site is. If you're basically putting a burden on that, a prospective buyer or developer may be unwilling to do what he's proposing to do because of the debt attached to it. And it might be that the council decide we're better writing off this debt to allow this, whatever the development is, to progress. I think that's something that's maybe been overlooked as well.
So you don't think there's that flexibility in the bill to do that?
No.
Okay. Ms Boyack?
Not on that issue. No.
Okay. Do you want to come in again with your next question?
On another issue?
Oh, okay.
No, just a
John Wilson.
Mr MacDonald.
Mr MacDonald.
In terms of, could you just clarify, Mr MacDonald, in terms of the debt accrued because of the work that's been carried out with the council, are you saying that the council, North Lanarkshire Council, would write off the debt if they thought the land or the building was going to become productive use, rather than chasing the money that's been expended?
I think what would happen is, obviously, for building standards, we would go through legal, finance, etc. to pursue the debt. But if there's a debt attached to a property now, dependent, obviously, it varies in each individual case. But if you had an area which was really the building or the property it was on was causing a problem to that community round about it. You had a prospective developer proposing to do some works, and he then comes to the council going, I'm proposing to do this, but I need to pay, I don't know, £30,000 initially because of the burden on that property. It might be that the council would maybe think we're getting a greater benefit from letting the £30,000 go to whatever his proposal is. Obviously, that will vary in case by case, because you need to look at individual cases, obviously, rather than have a general rule.
Right, thank you.
Okay. Ms Boyack.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up a point that Susan Torrance's submission talks about in terms of the tenement management scheme that you come from the Tenements Act in 2004, and it's your comment about having to rely on the what's in the title deeds of each tenant. And I'm just going to ask, to what extent does this new bill potentially give you opportunities to recover monies and to get works done? Because the experience of the tenant management scheme, if it's major works that need to be done to make a building safe, has that scheme worked in the sense that you need a 50% agreement amongst owners? Where you don't get that, is this provision something that's going to meet the gap when you can't get things going?
I think it's going to solve some of the issues to do with the Tenant Management Act, and particularly where there are non-housing association factors managing some tenement stairs, which is the case in Glasgow. So, I mean, it's all about getting the power and ability to carry out the works legally. And obviously there's one route provided by the Act, but if the circumstances aren't such, as you say, that 50% of the owners, if say the association only owns 2 properties out of 6, so there are issues to do with that, which this bill won't rectify. But given a fair wind, where the title deeds do supply the power to act, where there's a tenant management arrangement in place, whereby, as I say, that the majority of owners want the works to be carried out. Maybe the 1 or 2 maybe who are recalcitrant in terms of actually paying their share. If there was the ability to work with local authorities and find some way of using the charging order route, our members would be whooping with joy, to be fair, because it is a huge issue for them. As responsible landlords, they have a duty to carry out repairs, ensure their tenants are living in safe environments, follow through the Scottish Housing Quality Standard and all the other standards that are imposed on housing in public or housing association ownership. But it's how to fairly recoup from owners who, for various reasons, can't or won't comply, that is the issue, and has a substantial cost and burden to our members.
Yeah, I suppose I'm just trying to test whether you think this bill does that, because I've certainly got lots of casework where a majority of people want works to be taken, but unless you pay the money up front to a builder, nothing will happen. And it's whether this potentially lets the local authority or owners who want works to take place, does this bill let them get on and get it done under the management of the local authority?
Lawrence.
I'm not sure it does at the moment, which is why I think our comments were to if there was some way of ensuring within guidance or secondary legislation or whatever, or probably guidance notes would be the best way of addressing it, that there was some way of linking collaboration with housing associations. I mean, we'll provide the money up front, I would suggest, to actually carry out the works. And again, we did a discussion about liabilities resting on local authorities to actually put the money up, the capital up front to help the works progress. Housing associations would more than pay their liability in order to undertake that. But it is the recovery mechanism that the local authority has at the moment that the housing association doesn't have, that if we could have some way through guidance or legislation in order to link into that.
Ms Boyack's point is, I think, while we all know that housing associations and most other public house owners would quite willingly pay the money up front, there may be a situation where you have got, for example, 1 flat in a block of 6 belonging to a housing association, that others in the building want those repairs, but if they don't have the money to pay up front, it's unlikely to happen. I think that's Ms Boyack's point.
I think the point I'm making is that housing associations would and do step into the breach at that point in time. And I did have a discussion about the bill with members a few weeks ago, and that is the practice, because as responsible landlords, where they own 4 out of 6 or 3 out of 6 properties in a close, or even 1 out of 6, they have a responsibility to ensure the safety of their tenants. And obviously, what is it? If there was 1 out of 6 properties and it was a £500,000 repair, that might be a slightly different decision that they might make in terms of having the resources to carry that out. But I think that would be very extreme. But what I am saying is that they would move in, carry out all the works, and then attempt to recover, as they do, costs from individual owners who they've carried out works on behalf of through the powers under the Tenement Acts or the title deeds or whatever.
Does anyone else wish to come in and Ms Boyack's point there? No. Sarah?
Yeah, no, I've just seen the other side where even the housing associations won't put that money up front, and I'm just trying to see what difference this bill would make. Presumably the local authority still has to agree to pick the issue up and still has to agree to actually manage this. So I suppose it's a response from local authority colleagues.
Yes, I think that would be.
Do you see this bill leading to more pieces of work being initiated by yourselves, and how do you view that?
Ms McBurney, do you want to go first?
Can I just clarify the point you're making? Are you saying that in certain instances a housing association would pay all the repair money up front, but then seek the council to recover the costs on your behalf?
Yes, we would like to have the flexibility of charging orders rather than having to go through the courts as at present, where what happens in a lot of instances is a lot of expense and we don't recover anything, so it's written off.
My only comment on that as a public authority is then obviously that would be the taxpayer money that would be used to recover the costs for a housing association, as opposed to you recovering the costs yourself. So my concern there would only be in terms of administration and additional costs for the council. But I certainly think it might be something that would be worth thinking about further. But I'm not so sure that the bill actually covers that.
Covers it, yes.
Mr Delamar?
Yeah, I'm of the same opinion. It sounds like a good idea and a benefit, but you'd have to look at the legal implications for local authorities taking on the burden of private sector through the purposes of a charging order. And that would be something for legal to...
Okay. Mr MacDonald?
Yeah, just the same, yeah.
Okay. Stuart McMillan, you wanted to come in on this point?
That's okay, Convener.
Okay. Sarah Boyack, please.
My next question. Can I ask a bit about the issue of prevention, which is mentioned by Mr Sutton? You've made a reference in your submission about whether this bill will actually lead to people being more prevention orientated in terms of what they're doing. Do you think this bill is going to change the climate in terms of how people make decisions? Or you've talked about other mechanisms about exploring whether you could apply the council tax at a different rate. We did that in the Parliament last year through the empty properties bill that went through. So it's just whether that has had any impact on your thoughts about this bill.
Mr. Sutton? Not particularly. I mean, I'm not sure that this bill in itself will actually do that, but I think there needs to be a more concerted approach, if you like, across all the relevant legislation. I mean, I think within councils we're getting better of housing and building standards and planning all working together, and we are looking to find solutions. But, I mean, apologies if I go back to the Dundivan example. 4 or 5 years ago, we were able to work with the local housing association to get a scheme that stacked up, that left a residual value on that property, so the paper company that had acquired it for £10,000 would have walked away with, if you like, about £35,000 worth of profit. When we reran that costings with the housing association 2 or 3 years ago, and indeed about a year ago, if you like, we suddenly had a deficit of 100 to 200 grand. So schemes that used to stack up through joint working together no longer stack up. And I think, you know, that there's a general overall tightening the lottery conditions, for example, that if a trust takes on an old building and it makes a profit on it, now that profit goes back to the trust rather than go into a rotating fund. So there's that, what I call a general tightening up. And for most trusts or bodies who try and take on and resolve these problems, you will get you know, the 80–90% of the capital. It's getting that last 5–10% of the capital is the issue. And one of the concerns I know there was about the Community Empowerment Bill is you can get the building sorted as a one-off capital, but how do you make sure you're going to cover the running costs? Because there are examples where communities have taken on buildings in all the best intentions and interest, and yet it's fallen flat on its face because the revenue plans were optimistic or whatever. So I think there are difficulties there that need to be thought through as to what sort of help and support can, you know, where bodies are effectively working together, whether it's with tenants or local residents or whatever. How do you, if you like, unlock some of those difficult sites? Because that's, I think, the situation that now exists, certainly in North Lanarkshire, is we've got sites that, even working together with housing, with the lottery, whatever, are struggling to make them stack up and get a solution to them.
Okay. Ms Boyag.
I suppose the other side of that is there are other areas where land is phenomenally expensive, cities like Aberdeen, bits of Dundee, Edinburgh, Glasgow, where you do have a problem with defective buildings, and the costs are much more extreme. And in that context, this bill would play a different kind of role, where there are people with pockets that are deep enough to pay for the repairs but aren't prepared to do that. I suppose I'm interested in seeing to what extent this bill helps meet some of the gaps there.
Do you think the bill helps in that regard? Will we start with Mr MacDonald?
Yes, I think if you've got, as I said before, if it's a substantial sum of money, and I think the bill would help there, because obviously, we're saying that if the person who owns the property, land, whatever, has deep pockets, as you say, you maybe the disadvantage is you're giving them 30 years to pay it off, or maybe it should be sooner, depending on the amount of debt there is there. But
certain folk with deep pockets often have a poacher's pocket so that they can slip money into without anybody knowing. How do we get around that?
I think by putting the burden on the property, though, yes, if you've got something that's attractive, what you're describing, whether it's the property, whether it's the land, or whether it's the building, I think there's more likely a sale will take place in the future. So I think this bill will help that.
Sir Delamar?
Yeah, I agree that where you have confidence that the people that you are pursuing for repairs that you do undertake have the money to pay, there's more confidence to go ahead with the notice to repair, and there's a better chance of recovering the cost of any work that a local authority undertakes.
Do you have situations at this moment in time where you are pursuing folk who you know are probably likely to have more than enough to pay for what you're carrying out, but you're unable to get that? And do you think that this bill will overcome that situation?
Well, we have whether that person has the money, we're not quite sure, but we do have a property at the moment where there's two owners. It was a gable deterioration of the chimney stack, and it was directly above a neighbouring single-storey property and onto a public footpath right beside a bus stop. So there was a requirement to just go in there straight away and fix the chimney by putting scaffolding up. The two owners involved, one who's on the first floor is more than happy to pay and has been paying. The person who's on the ground floor hasn't been paying. We're now in difficulties now because the person on the ground floor who has a business and other property has unfortunately died. So we can no longer pursue under our civil debt recovery methods the costs involved. Whereas the charging order, in this instance, we can serve it on the property, and knowing that at some point in time that building will be sold or whatever, and we'll be in a position to recover costs there.
Okay, Ms McCartney.
Yes, we have a site where we have an absentee owner in Antigua, I believe he lives, and the council has incurred some substantial costs in keeping the site safe and the building safe, and we do understand that he is currently in discussions with several people to buy the site, which involves us continually checking to see if the site has sold. So a charging order in circumstances like that would be ideal for us, because then we would hopefully be able to recoup the cost at the sale of the land. In East Renfrewshire, we have areas of East Renfrewshire where the land values are 3 times higher than land values in other towns within our area, and in some instances the regeneration aspects are actually more important in terms of the site being sold for development, so that it stops being a blight on a community. And in other areas, we know that we necessarily don't need to get involved because the land will sell itself, and that the land values of the development that will happen upon completion will outweigh any charges that will be on the site.
Thanks. I'm aware time is wearing on, and we have Mr Stewart to take in as well at the end. So brief questions and brief answers now, if possible, please. Sarah, are you finished?
There's a question from East Renfrewshire. In the disadvantages sections, you were asking a few points of clarification as to how what could be included from local authorities in terms of your final charging order.
Yes.
Is that the way the bill is written, or do you think that could be dealt with in guidance? The issues you've mentioned are things like, is it possible for the cost of council staff putting the work together to come up with the survey work, any work you've had to do within the council, presumably negotiations on what's reasonable in terms of payback. Is that something you think should be set out explicitly in the bill, or is that something that you think should come from guidance from the Scottish Government?
I think we would be happy with it being in guidance. If clarification was required, I'd be happy with it in guidance, as long as it was clear what the council could recharge.
Okay.
Thank you. Stuart McMillan, please. No, you're fine. Okay. Dave Stewart, please.
Yeah, thank you, Convener, for inviting me along today. I just want to put a couple of questions to the witnesses. I think there's been a very interesting some questions and answer session. Clearly, though, then we have to set the context that this bill is a members' bill and can't sort out every problem that you rightly address. This is about cost recovery for dangerous and defective buildings. We know the statistics at 3.9 million, according to the Scottish Government's outstanding in debt, so this is a real problem. I'm interested in your points about charging orders, which is the main issue here. I'm quite relaxed about varying the 30-year period at stage 2 to a 5-year period and a variable 25, or something that's technically competent, and secondly, taking on board the issue that it would be variable according to the level of the debt. If it's only 5,000 or 6,000, clearly 5 years is a better period. As you well know, the 30-year period wasn't invented by me, it was echoed other legislation and echoed what happened from 1959 to 2003. So clearly the Act lifted existing well-used legislation. How would the panel members feel about that variation at stage 2?
Who's wanting to go first there? Mr Sutton?
Be supportive of it.
Okay. Ms McCartney?
Yes, very supportive of those proposals.
Mr Delamar?
Welcome those proposals.
Mr MacDonald?
Yes, totally agree. I think the 30-year period was one of the things that was cropped up as being a disadvantage. I think bringing the flexibility in would be an improvement.
Ms Torrance?
The flexibility, I think, would be welcome.
I'm conscious of time. The second question I have is, as you know, the Community Empowerment has potential legislation has a notice of liability issue that's been developed. How would the panel feel if at stage 2 I incorporated the notice of liability and there's a hybrid or as a separate aspect to my bill?
Mr Sutton?
Yeah, I would very much support that. The point we've made is that the liability order goes on the individual, and ignorance is no excuse. So if somebody, again, sorry I keep coming back to paper companies, but we do have some people that are like that, and so we say we have
Antigua and other places.
Well,
yes.
no, not quite that, but in Leicester, and even with the question of is it then English law to recover the money if one of the directors is in Leicester rather than in Scotland. So there can be issues. The liability order also removes any excuse. Once you've told them that they're liable and go through the proper procedures, because the proposal that is in the Community Empowerment Bill, as I say, is already in the 2011 Historic Environment Amendment Bill. So far as I'm aware, with conservation officers, there's no experience of it being used in Scotland as yet, but certainly it is a useful tool in our negotiations with those sorts of companies. So we'd very much welcome that choice, if you like. Ms McCartney?
Yes, I'd be quite happy with that.
Okay, Mr Delamar?
Yep, I agree. Yeah, more tools we have to our belt, the better.
Does anyone disagree? No. Okay. Mr
The final question. I've had some representations, particularly from local authorities who I've met extensively over the last year, that there should be some element of backdating of the charging order. Obviously, it lost its life in 2005, and there would obviously have to be certain time limit, for example, maybe 2 years or so on, because clearly we're talking about nearly £4 million worth of debt across Scotland. If that was legally and technically possible, what would the panel's view being on a short period of backdating of charging orders for dangerous and defective work?
Mr Sutton?
I think it's a difficult one, because what I'm always mindful of what the legal defences are, certainly to the use of the listed building legislation, and part of that is that they have been given an opportunity to undertake the works directly themselves. If there is clear evidence that they've been given that opportunity, that it is the most cost-effective solutions, etc., then I think, yes, one might be prepared to consider it. But I think I'm more critical that we get legislation that is good as we go forward, rather than I just think it raises all sorts of other issues.
Ms McCartney?
Personally, from a personal point of view, I think I might have some concerns about that, just simply because of the procedures around it and how that would be administered, and would it be for everybody that we've ever served a notice on, which could potentially be quite a lot of people and quite a lot of administration. I'd probably just be happy if we got legislation in that allowed charging orders from a fixed point in time and then move forward.
There could be a number of owners for the same building over quite a short period of time. Is that an experience that you've had?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Okay. Mr Delamar?
Yeah, and I know there are instances of the authorities that have requested this due to the amount of money that has been laid out on single properties, and I can see an argument for that. Yeah, I think if you're able to prove through your documentation that clear there is a single owner involved and there is a clear audit process that has been followed, I don't see any reason why, if the charging order could be backdated, you could utilise that on specific jobs that you would see as beneficial.
Have you had experience of buildings, defective buildings, changing hands quite quickly between folk?
Well, this is the one that I just sort of explained earlier on. That's the fear that we have at the moment, that this building is slipped or sold from under our feet, and we're not in there to recover the cost just now.
Mr MacDonald?
I don't think there'd be a great benefit. I think the administration and legal finding out of where it's changed hands, even the unscrupulous, where it's moved from the husband's name to the wife's name, or moved from one company to another company, I think we'd end up tying ourselves in knots. I don't think the benefit would be there.
Mr MacDonald, you've had some of the experiences that I've had as a councillor previously. Ms Torrance?
What was I going to say? My mind's gone blank. I think I concur with what everybody else has said.
Can I just make one? I do think
Mr Sutton?
that is absolutely important is that you're able to pre-register the charging order with the registers of Scotland, because to have a 3 or 4 month gap from the point you give them notice and commit to the building work before you can then get it eventually registered does, if you like, open and provide a gap for the unscrupulous. And if there was a way of pre-registering it so that, if you like, they can't do it, that, in my view, will be a much more important gap to plug than trying to apply it retrospectively.
I think that's a reasonable point. I think that's the advantage of having a hybrid creature, which would be partly notice of liability and also charging, that would stop the gap. And the final point, and I know I'm preaching to converted to local authority colleagues, is clearly that if the bill was successful, it's not going to be compulsory of local authorities to carry it out. This would be a risk assessment carried out by building control officers and legal to decide where this is appropriate. Most people pay for repairs. Cost recovery has always been open, but it gives another tool in the armoury. That's all my questions.
Okay, any comments on that final statement by Mr Stewart?
Just on the fact, we now have planning performance things, and clearly if it was identified as a performance indicator, not only would you allow to gather the data as to whether it's actually being used, but our council's actually applying the legislation in practice.
This committee has done a lot of work round about performance indicators, Mr Sutton, and if you want changes to performance indicators, I think you maybe need to talk to COSLA in the first instance, who have gone through a huge amount of work lately in terms of looking at that. Can I thank you all very much for your evidence here today, and suspend until about 10 past, and then we'll move into private session at that point. Thank you.
Right.